So in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at some of the causes of World War I. Now, in 1914, Europe was in a relative state of peace. There hadn't been a major war between European powers since the 1870s with the Franco-Prussian War between France and Germany. There hadn't been a major war between several European powers since the Crimean War in the 1850s, and there hadn't been a major European war since the early 1800s, the Napoleonic Wars. However, in 1914, Europe was still on the verge of war. There were tensions amongst the great powers, and the outbreak of war was more likely as a result. In this lesson today, we're going to be looking at some of the indirect causes that helped lead to the war, some of these underlying tensions that made war so likely in 1914. And in order to do this, we're going to answer these two basic questions. One, what is the difference between indirect and direct causes? And two, what were some of the indirect causes of World War I? So to begin, this idea of indirect versus direct causes. In order to understand how World War I began, we have to know what both of these are. We have to understand that there's a difference between these. For any historical event, there will be both indirect and direct factors that lead to that event happening. So the direct causes of an event, these are the immediate causes that lead to something happening, the thing that led to the event. So for example, being killed by getting hit by a car. The direct cause of your death is being hit by a car. But there are many indirect causes that also led to that event. All the little factors that led to you being in that right place at the right time. All the factors that led to you being there. The reason why you were there. The fact that you got there at that time. Where you were going. All of these are indirect factors which help lead to the fact that you were there for the direct cause to impact you in the first place. And so in regards to World War I, we have several indirect causes that lead to the war. And we can remember these using the acronym MAIN. And these stand for our 4 indirect causes of the war. And they are as follows. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And you can think of these factors as the gunpowder that fuels the bomb. But without a spark, the bomb can't go off. These are things that are making war more likely, that are causing lots of tensions between these countries that make them want to go to war with each other, and any small little thing can set it off. But without a spark, we don't have a war. These are the indirect causes that kind of push us towards war. And so with that in mind, let's look at what these 4 indirect causes are in a little more detail. Our first cause here is militarism. Now, militarism is the policy of building up your armed forces and weaponry and threatening armed aggression. The idea of an arms race. So having a strong military helps you make you a powerful country. Think of the U.S. today. The U.S. by far spends the most on their military, and not coincidentally, they are the most powerful country in the world. It gives them a lot of strength. It gives them a lot of leverage in terms of how they deal with other countries. The U.S. can have a lot of influence a lot of other countries and can get its way in a lot of cases because it has that military power to back itself up. You don't want to mess with the U.S. or get on their bad side because, you could not win a war against them, is the idea. Now, thinking back to 1914, prior to the outbreak of World War I, this was going on too. So we had a major arms race developing between Great Britain and Germany, and this was a naval arms race. Their desire was to have the strongest navy so they could get their way in terms of European affairs. The country with the strongest navy would be seen as the most powerful country in Europe and have a lot more influence around the world. And one particular way that this arms race played out was in regards to the dreadnought. This was a ship that was built around this time, and it was kind of a cutting-edge ship, kind of the highest technology at the time. The British were the first to launch their version of the dreadnought in 1906, and it was seen as far more advanced than naval ships of the 19th century. Prior to this point, you do have ships that are running on steam engines, but a lot of these navies not long before this were using, sail ships and things like that. The dreadnought was far faster, far more powerful, could carry far more weaponry. And the fact that Britain was making these ships and using them in their navy made them very powerful. This threatened other countries, however. Controlling the seas gives you a lot of power geopolitically. You can access, pretty much anywhere around the world. Having a navy was really important to Britain because of their global empire at this time. So they needed to be able to protect their interests all around the world. It also helps you do things like set up blockades if you want to prevent countries from being able to trade with each other. Having a strong navy allows you to do that. But other countries were threatened by this. So other countries, particularly Germany, felt the need to build up their own ships and to build up their own navy in order to keep up. So Germany started building these dreadnoughts as well because they were in competition with Britain to be the most powerful country in Europe. So this in turn just forced Britain to expand their fleet to maintain their advantage in terms of this, how many ships they had. So Germany starts building more ships. That causes Britain to want to build more ships, which causes Germany to want to build more ships, etc., etc., etc. And you can see how this gets out of hand really quickly. So you have these two countries, and they're building up their navies very, very fast. So if war was to ever be set off, you have both these countries with huge arms at their disposal, ready to go to war. So you can see a small instance, a small spark could lead to a really big war because these countries have been building up their militaries for a long period of time. Now, having a strong military is one thing, but you also want to have friends to back you up. So this brings us to our second indirect cause of the war, which is alliances. So alliances are agreements made between two or more countries to give each other help if it is needed. So for example, in World War I, we have two major alliances that were formed prior to the start of the war. On the one hand, we have the Triple Entente. This was composed of Britain, France, and Russia. And on the other side, we have the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers, made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, these alliances were formed prior to the start of World War I. And the idea here was that these countries wanted to have alliances. They wanted to have countries to back them up in the event that they went to war. The idea of these alliances was that if one country was attacked, they would be obligated to protect the other countries in their alliance. So if one country goes to war, it kind of drags everyone else into it. And you can see how this could lead, having a small, localized conflict could really quickly escalate into a Europe-ranging war, because a small conflict between two countries on opposite ends of the alliances brings in all the other countries. Another issue is that these were secret alliances prior to the start of war. These alliances were not things that were necessarily well known by the general public. They weren't out in the open. And again, this helps lead to this kind of precarious situation where countries can sort of accidentally get into a war with one another. We can have a really big war coming out of a relatively small incident. Again, a small conflict between two countries can easily snowball into a European war when you have alliances like this. So this map here just shows you sort of where these countries were in Europe. And again, here's how the alliances look. Here's another map of how it looked. One thing you might notice, so the countries in the light blue greenish color here, so Great Britain, France, Russia, they were the Allied powers, or the Triple Entente. And then the purple colors here, those are the Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance. One thing you might notice is that there was a big strategic advantage for Britain, France, and Russia, the Triple Entente here, is that they were able to surround the Triple Alliance countries. You can see Germany, they have France on the western side and Russia on the eastern side. This is a big disadvantage for Germany. If they were ever to get into a war, they would have to fight a war on two fronts. They would have to fight France in the west and Russia in the east. And again, what this means essentially is that you would have to split your army into two. You'd have to send half your army to fight on the western half and half your army to fight on the eastern half. Whereas Russia and France could kind of devote all their troops to just the one front that they have to fight this war on. So before the war would even start, Germany is at a huge strategic disadvantage here. Again, another reason why these alliances might have been come up with in the first place, because you want to put your country in the best strategic position possible before the war breaks out. You might also notice some neutral countries here. So countries like Switzerland, Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, they were not involved in the war. They decided to stay neutral. Not every country in Europe was part of an alliance or decided to join the war immediately. You might also notice Italy here is grouped in with the Allied powers. they actually switched sides early on in the war. Even though they were a part of the Triple Alliance, they don't really fight alongside them. And early on in the war, they actually switched sides and ended up declaring war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, the problem is that these countries weren't just limited in territory to Europe. These were countries with global empires. So that brings us to our next indirect cause of World War I, which is imperialism. Now, imperialism is when a country takes over new lands or countries and makes them subject to their rule, when they begin starting empires around the world. And this was very common in the 1800s. You saw countries, especially European countries, going elsewhere in the world, going to Africa and Southeast Asia to expand their empires, to take over new colonies and territories, and to make their empires bigger. Now, Britain was the most successful during this period, and other countries became envious of their wealth, power, and influence. And again, during the 1800s, having a big empire, if you had a big empire, it kind of made you a more powerful country. Again, thinking back to what we were saying about militarism, how having a big military makes you powerful, kind of the prestige of having a big empire worked in a lot the same way. And a country like Germany, which was actually kind of late in terms of building up its empire, they really saw this as sort of a means towards becoming a more powerful country. Germany was only unified into what we think of today as Germany in the 1800s. They were a younger country. So when they looked towards Britain and France, which had had empires for a couple hundred years at this point, they thought this was a way to sort of being taken seriously on the world stage by expanding out into building their empires elsewhere around the world. What this means, though, is that now you have all these conflict zones around the world where, war could potentially be sparked. And you have these countries, Britain, France, Germany, they're all in Africa trying to gain the same territories, the same colonies, going after the same resources. So this is another instance where you could potentially have conflicts between these countries and lead to war. And here's a map of what the colonial powers looked like in 1914, just prior to the outbreak of World War I. You can see almost all of Africa and Southeast Asia has been colonized by the European powers. And again, this prestige of having an empire, this was a real thing. There's a famous saying that goes back to the 19th century that goes something like, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." And this is something that, people in the British colonies, including Canada, would have told themselves and told their children. And it was a point of pride. And this was literally true. The sun did never set on the British Empire. There were British colonies on all the continents. So no matter where you were in the world, there was a British colony where it was daylight. The sun literally never set on the British Empire. So for British subjects, this was something to be proud of. You were part of something bigger. So if you lived in Canada, even though Canada today is a middle power, we're a medium-sized country, we're not the most powerful military in the world by any stretch of the imagination. But if you looked back to when we were part of the British Empire at this time, Canadians would have thought of themselves as being part of this thing that was bigger than themselves. It was a point of pride, something to be proud of. And this brings us to our final indirect cause of the war. This idea of nationalism. Now, nationalism is love for your country. The increased pride in one's country and the nation's accomplishments. Now, again, on its own, this can be a good thing. Lots of people are proud of the country they live in, and that's perfectly fine. However, where we get into problems is this idea of unquestioned nationalism, being proud of your country no matter what. So you can think of, kind of the differences between the ways that Canadians are nationalistic, maybe versus the way that some Americans are nationalistic. Sure, in Canada we have, lots of examples of nationalism. Think of things like Canada Day celebrations, standing for the anthem in the morning, tributes to the military. Again, we have all those things, and again, on their own, they're not necessarily bad things. But if they get taken too far, you can end up with sort of this unquestioned nationalism. So if you think in the U.S., they do a lot of these same things, and it's kind of turned up to 10. The volume's really turned up on it. And you'll get into situations where you think of people protesting the national anthem or protesting against wars in the past. If you look at, we go back to the early 2000s, protests against the Iraq War. A lot of those people who protested against the war were, called un-American for questioning what their country was doing. So when you get into that situation where questioning your country is sort of looked down upon or discouraged. In this kind of unquestioned nationalism, you should be proud of your country no matter what. That's where we start to run into some problems. If we go back to the early 1900s, nationalism was definitely in full force in Europe. Thinking of the idea of back to militarism, again, we have a really strong navy, being proud of that, having the biggest empire, thinking of that as a source of pride. All of these countries had these sort of sources of nationalism at the time. The nations of Europe by the turn of the 1900s were developing very different cultural traditions and histories. Again, nationalism could take a lot of different forms. It could be things like, your language, being proud of the fact that you have a common heritage with the people who live in your country. All of these things kind of lead to a sense of community, which, again, on its own is not necessarily bad, but it can make you, think differently or think lesser of other nations, of other peoples, of other cultures. So this is sort of where we run into these tensions. It makes you think that, our country is the best. Therefore, we should rule all of Europe. We should be the most powerful country in Europe. We should be the most powerful country in the world. Nationalism goes unquestioned. We start running into these things. Now, all of these factors help set the stage for war. European countries in 1914, their militaries are being built up, alliances have been made, countries were expanding their influence around the world, and these nations were very proud and nationalistic. But again, on its own, this is not enough to start a war. This is making countries more likely to go to war with each other, but we still need a spark, a reason for a war to break out, something to start snowballing and to spiral into war. Again, these things are just the fuel for the bomb. It hasn't been sparked yet. We don't have anything to set it off. The bomb was just waiting for a spark. And that spark would come on June 28th, 1914 in Sarajevo. But more on that to come in a future lesson. So in summary, today you learned historical events have both direct and indirect causes. In the years prior to World War I, there were several key international trends that made war more likely. These trends included militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And we can remember these indirect trends by using the acronym MAIN. These four indirect causes meant that all that was needed for a war to start was a spark.